The world knows Clint Eastwood as the man with no name, the squinting cowboy who made silence more powerful than dialogue, the director who turned violence into poetry and aging into art. But on a September evening in 1951, long before Hollywood, long before the poncho and the cigar and the westerns that made him a legend, a 21-year-old nobody named Clint Eastwood Jr. was strapped into the back seat of a Navy Douglas AD bomber, flying through thick fog over the Pacific Ocean. When the pilot's voice crackled through the radio with words that would change everything, the engine was failing. They were going down. And in the next few minutes, this unknown kid from Oakland would face a choice between drowning in dark, water, or swimming toward lights he couldn't be sure were real. A choice that would either kill him or forge the kind of man who, decades later, would look death in the eye through a camera lens and never blink. What happened that night in the cold Pacific has been mostly forgotten. Buried in military records and rarely discussed in the countless interviews Eastwood has given over 7 decades in Hollywood. But the truth is that Clint Eastwood died and was reborn in those black waves off Point Reyes, California, and everything that came after. The squint, the silence, the fearlessness, the way he directed movies like a man who had already survived the worst thing that could happen. All of it traces back to the moment a Navy plane hit the ocean and a terrified young man decided he wasn't ready to die. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten story, if you appreciate these deep dives into the untold moments that shaped Hollywood legends, please subscribe and turn on notifications. These are the stories that explain how ordinary people become icons, and your support helps us keep uncovering them. Now let's go back to 1951 and understand who Clint Eastwood was before he became Clint Eastwood in 1951. Clint Eastwood Jr. was nobody. He had graduated from Oakland Technical High School in 1949 with no clear direction. He worked odd jobs, logging trucks, pumping gas. When the Korean War started in 1950, he enlisted in the Army, did basic training at Fort Ord near Monterey, California. The Army discovered Eastwood could swim well and transferred him to swimming instructor duty. That transfer would save his life, because swimming instructors at Fort Ord worked with the Navy, and by late 1951, Eastwood found himself catching rides on Navy transport planes, shuttling between bases. The military in 1951 was chaotic, millions being trained for Korea. Transport flights happened constantly. On September 30th, 1951, Eastwood caught a ride on a Navy AD bomber, a routine flight down the California coast. The pilot was young, logging hours. Weather was deteriorating, fog rolling in from the Pacific, but the flight went ahead. Eastwood climbed into the rear gunner position, and the plane took off into gathering darkness. For a while, everything was fine. Then the engine coughed, sputtered. The steady hum became silence. And suddenly, the plane wasn't flying anymore. It was falling, dropping through fog toward an ocean Eastwood couldn't see, but knew was there. The pilot fought for control, tried to restart the engine, aimed for what he hoped was shoreline. But in that fog with no power and no visibility, hope was all he had. The plane hit the Pacific Ocean hard. Not a smooth water landing, not the kind of thing you see in movies where everyone walks away. A violent impact that crumpled metal and threw Eastwood forward against his restraints, hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. To fill his vision with white stars and confusion, water poured in immediately, shockingly cold, even for September, the kind of cold that steals breath and makes muscles seize. Eastwood released his harness, pushed away from the sinking wreckage, kicked toward what he thought was up, broke the surface, gasping and disoriented. The plane was already gone, disappeared into black water like it had never existed. The pilot surfaced near him, both men treading water in darkness and fog, no land visible in any direction, no lights. No sounds except waves and their own labored breathing. They were alive, but they were also alone in the Pacific Ocean, with no life vests, no rescue equipment, no way to signal for help, no idea which direction was safety and which direction was death. What happened next was hours of swimming through darkness toward lights that kept disappearing. The pilot thought he had seen lights before the crash. They swam in that direction, but fog and waves made everything uncertain. Lights would appear, disappear, panic would rise. Eastwood had been a lifeguard, knew how to move efficiently in water, how to conserve energy, but this wasn't a pool. This was the Pacific in darkness, water cold enough to cause hypothermia, Waves large enough to overwhelm tired swimmers, great white sharks patrolled these waters. Every brush of seaweed felt like teeth, but they couldn't think about that. They could only swim, stroke after stroke, hour after hour. Muscles burning, then going numb. The swim took somewhere between 2 and 3 hours, though neither man could say for certain afterward. Time stops meaning much when you're fighting to survive. But eventually, impossibly, miraculously, Eastwood's feet touched bottom, felt sand and rock beneath him, knew that land was real and close. They stumbled ashore somewhere near Point Reyes, California, too exhausted to celebrate, too cold to feel relief. Just grateful to be horizontal on something solid. They were found shortly after by local residents who called for help, and within hours Eastwood was back on base, wrapped in blankets, answering questions from officers who wanted to understand how a routine transport flight had ended with a plane at the bottom of the Pacific and 2 servicemen who should be dead walking back into the base looking like they'd seen something that changed them forever, because they had seen what it feels like to believe you're going to die and then survive anyway. They had learned that the line between living and drowning is thinner than anyone wants to believe. And for Eastwood specifically, that night in the ocean would become the foundation of everything he would build as an actor and director, even if he would rarely talk about it publicly. The military's official response was minimal. Investigation, paperwork, cause examined. Mechanical failure, probably carburetor icing. The pilot wasn't blamed. Eastwood wasn't blamed. It was an accident. Both men survived with no serious injuries, so the incident didn't require extensive publicity. The Navy preferred to keep training accidents quiet. The crash was noted in records and forgotten. Eastwood received medical clearance, returned to swimming instructor duties, finished his service in 1953 to the military. Clint Eastwood Jr. was just another serviceman who got lucky once. But something had changed in Eastwood that night, something that wouldn't become visible until Hollywood came calling. The crash taught him lessons that would define his career. First, control is an illusion. You can do everything right and still end up in the ocean. That made Eastwood both fatalistic and fearless. Second, panic kills. In the water, the moments he wanted to stop swimming were the moments closest to death. Survival meant staying calm. That lesson translated directly into his acting style. The economy of movement, the stillness. Third, silence has power. In the ocean, talking wasted energy. The experience was too big for casual conversation. Silence protected it. That preference for silence would become Eastwood's signature. When Eastwood left the military in 1953, he drifted for a while. Took classes at Los Angeles City College using the GI Bill. Met people who knew people in the film industry. Got some screen tests, landed tiny parts. He was still nobody, just another tall guy trying to break into Hollywood, competing with thousands of other tall guys who also thought they could be the next Gary Cooper. But Eastwood had something they didn't. He had drowned and come back. He had the stillness of someone who had already faced the worst thing and survived. When directors told him to be more animated, to show more emotion, to fill the screen with energy, Eastwood couldn't do it. Not because he lacked talent, but because that wasn't who he was anymore. He was the guy who had conserved every movement in the Pacific, who had learned that stillness was strength. Universal Studios signed him to a contract in 1954, then dropped him in 1955 with a note that he was too slow, and his Adam's apple was too prominent. They saw a failure. They didn't see a survivor. The years between 1955 and 1964 were difficult. Eastwood worked steadily, but not successfully. Guest spots on TV, small roles, barely surviving. He married Maggie Johnson in 1953, had a daughter, struggled with constant rejection. Then, in 1959, he got Rawhide, playing second lead, 217 episodes over 7 years. It gave Eastwood time to develop the minimalist-style directors kept telling him to abandon. He learned to do more with less, to trust the camera. And he learned the most interesting characters often weren't the ones talking most. By 1964, Eastwood was 34 years old and going nowhere fast. Still playing second lead on a TV Western that was losing viewers and getting canceled. And then an Italian director named Sergio Leone offered him $15,000 to star in a low-budget Western being shot in Spain. The script was weird. The director didn't speak English. The whole thing sounded like a disaster. Every agent and friend told Eastwood to turn it down, to wait for something better, to not waste his career on a foreign film that would probably never even get American distribution. But Eastwood had learned in the Pacific that sometimes you have to swim toward lights you can't be sure are real. Sometimes you have to risk everything because playing it safe is its own kind of drowning. He took the role, flew to Spain, made a fistful of dollars with Leone, and then for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, and became the man with no name. And suddenly Clint Eastwood wasn't nobody anymore. He was an icon. And the character that made him famous, the silent gunfighter who said little and revealed less, who communicated through squints and stillness and the minimum movement necessary. That character was possible because of what Eastwood had learned swimming through darkness off Point Reyes. 13 years earlier, the Dirty Harry films, the directing career that gave us Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby and Gran Torino. The way Eastwood worked as a director with minimal takes and maximum trust in actors. The legendary stories about him showing up on set, completely prepared and shooting efficiently while other directors agonized over every shot. All of it connects back to that night in the Pacific. Eastwood became a filmmaker who understood that you can't control everything, that you prepare as much as possible and then you trust yourself and your collaborators and you move forward without panic or waste. He became the anti-Spielberg. No storyboards, no endless rehearsals, no obsessive perfectionism. Just clarity about what the scene needed and the confidence to capture it and move on. That confidence came from having survived something that should have killed him, from knowing that if he could swim for hours in darkness toward uncertain lights, he could certainly make a movie. The plane crash was never a secret, exactly. Eastwood mentioned it occasionally in interviews over the decades, usually in passing, never with drama or detail. But it was never emphasized either, never became part of his public mythology, the way other origin stories become inseparable from their subjects. Partly that was Eastwood's preference for privacy, his dislike of discussing personal matters publicly. But partly it was timing. When Eastwood became famous in the late 1960s, his military service was 15 years in the past, and the crash was just another training accident in a war that had ended. Nobody cared about routine accidents, especially when both parties survived. Hollywood wanted to talk about the westerns, about the anti-hero persona, about his journey from TV cowboy to movie star. The plane crash didn't fit any convenient narrative, so it got forgotten, buried in old military records that few people would ever read. Clint Eastwood is 94 years old and still working, still directing films, still creating art that examines death and violence and aging with the clear eyes of someone who understands exactly what's at stake. When you watch his films, particularly the later ones, you see a filmmaker completely unafraid of mortality, willing to show bodies as fragile and life as contingent. $1 Million Baby ends with a mercy killing. Gran Torino ends with a Christ-like sacrifice. The Mule shows an old drug smuggler facing prison and death with quiet dignity. These aren't films made by someone who has carefully avoided thinking about death. These are films made by someone who met death in the Pacific Ocean at 21 and learned that fear of death is just wasted energy. You prepare, you do what needs doing, and you accept that control is mostly an illusion anyway. The story of Clint Eastwood almost dying in a plane crash isn't just a forgotten piece of Hollywood trivia. It's the origin story of everything that makes Eastwood who he is. The stillness, the silence, the fearlessness, the economy of style, the trust and simplicity. That night in the Pacific forged the man with no name long before Sergio Leone ever picked up a camera. It taught a 21-year-old kid from Oakland that survival requires calm, that panic kills, that silence has power, that you can't control outcomes but you can control your response. And those lessons became the foundation of a 7-decade career that changed American cinema. That proved a squint could be more powerful than dialogue, that stillness could be more compelling than action, that the most interesting stories often belong to people who have already survived the worst thing and carry that knowledge quietly inside them like a secret that shapes everything without needing to be spoken.